Let's go back to origins. Pascual Romero. For you, when does the genre start? And what he could, for me, it's Blizzard of Oz is the first hair metal record because of Randy Rhoads's. Those are some Quiet Riot riffs, and it's such a it's a big departure sonically from Black Sabbath and Ozzy. Listen to Ozzy solo stuff, listen to Black Sabbath. They really sound different, regardless of the guitar player Ozzy has. So for me, that's the first. For you, where are you putting the origins?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Blizzard of Oz is a great place to kind of pin that. For me, it was hard because as you kind of brought this up and talk, you know, and you kind of asked the question of like what's the origin and sort of where did it evolve from? And kind of as we were talking last week, it sort of dawned on me like that it was earlier than my brain wants it to be, because I'm thinking like, you know, for me it's like Shout at the Devil or you know, Rainbow in the Dark or something, like something that just got like that very like that specific sound. But then as we were talking about bands like Hanoi Rocks and stuff, I'm like, well, there's a lot more roots to that, like that deepens. So for me, I don't have a good answer for where it starts exactly for me, but there's this sort of blur from like 78 to 82 that just all of a sudden a bunch of bands were starting to do this thing where like you had like bands like Iron Maiden and Motorhead and like that were very roots oriented at their inception, and Motorhead never really changed, but as that kind of decade shifted, you know, you've got like, I think Blizzard of Oz landing at 1980 almost is the perfect like starting line for it, you know. So I think I would agree with you on that, because I never thought of Ozzy as hair metal because of the marketing angle of hair metal. And this is just me, like as a listener growing up, you know, like I was like, Ozzy's not hair metal, like he's metal. And but yeah, like I kind of look back on it and sort of analyze it from the perspective of like where, you know, what really were the elements that made it that, and then you have to land on guys like Randy Rhoads, you know. So so I do agree with that. I think that's, you know, that's a pretty good starting point for me. And I think some people find it controversial, but it's like, I don't know, man, like those Randy Rhoads riffs basically stayed alive through that entire decade. So you
go to any guitar center,
like it's just every kid learned, you know, Crazy Train, and every band sounded like they were doing their best to sound like Randy Rhoads, like every guitarist did. It just, you know, there were definitely some innovators, but that blend of that like rock and roll ethos with just savant level like instrumentation and composition and phrasing and rhythm, like it really just, he was like, here's the bar, now everyone can trip over it for the next 10 years.
Sully, what say you?
Well, I'm coming at this from a different spot, because I was there when it happened, man. So like hair metal wasn't a term until after it was dead.
Yep.
And so like Quiet Riot was a metal band. Motley Crue was a metal band. Def Leppard was a metal band. So that I can't, like, if I think of would Kiss be glam rock? Yeah, no, Kiss is a you could say that that's a glam rock band for sure. So it's hard for me to really say, you know, where the thing started, because if I think of hair metal, I think of well, number one, I think of it as kind of a derogatory term, and I know we're not meaning it in that way, but that's also like me. I mean, look, I look like I got kicked out of LA Guns 30 years ago. I'm self-aware. I mean, I get it. Look, I'm still glad I have this, so it's
you're winning right now. You're winning.
I'm doing all right, but so I don't really know when I would say when it started. I mean, I guess I could. I hear what Pascual's saying about, you know, Ozzy, because like Ozzy solo is 1,000% different from Black Sabbath, and you know, my introduction to Ozzy was the Ozzy solo stuff. And like Randy's like my guy. And yeah, so his Quiet Riot, a lot of those old Quiet Riot riffs are were repurposed, and that's like we don't need to go down a Randy Rose wormhole because like I won't leave. So I don't really know where I would say. I think that yeah, sure, you could say Ozzy going solo. Sure, that's cool. I don't
Right.
disagree. Yeah.
Oh, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I got into the genre really late. Grew up listening to funk, and was a huge Prince fan, and I liked the kind of funk music that blended rock elements into it. But for all intent and purpose, I really didn't get into what people would call metal broadly defined, including hair bands, until toward the end, according to this narrative of the hairband thing. It wasn't until 86, 87 where I felt confident enough in myself as a human being to embrace an art form in which the guitar was a central element, that a black kid wasn't supposed to embrace, right?
Yeah.
So playing against type was sort of challenging for me, but hip hop pushed me out, right? Because I needed some fucking guitars, and there weren't any instruments. So I was like, well, let's see what Dawkins doing. But so for me, you got that problem. I liked Pascual's answer with 83 though, because I think even though I think you've kind of persuaded me, Jason, with Blizzard, I do have a question though about that.
Sure.
It was really Motley Crue's Shout at the Devil that sort of piqued my interest at 12.
The US Festival
in the genre, right? It just I was intrigued. I really loved She's Got the Looks That Kills. I appreciated Mick Mars as playing, when I was 12 a lot more than I did when I was 17, when I discovered Yngwie late. But I appreciated their whole vibe, at least in the second album. And Too Fast for Love was all right too, but a little more punky. And I liked Dio in a perverse way as well. The point that you make about you have made, and I think Pascual certainly echoed about Blizzard of Oz, which I didn't listen to until once again, like 87. It is compelling. I guess the question that I have though about everyone sort of sounding like Randy, and I did kind of prefer Randy to Eddie, since I only got into the genre post Yngwie, right? So Eddie's innovations didn't really hit me until well after I dove even deeper into guitar, and I could appreciate, Eddie's greatness after the fact. So you guys think that Randy was a bigger influence on the hairband guys than Eddie?
This is just my opinion. If you listen to some of these records and you start going back into the classic, what we now call classic rock or album rock era that precedes this by a little bit, the musicianship on like the first Scorpions record when Sully's playing is next level.
Yeah.
And I think that has a lot of influence on what you're going to hear coming down the pike early on, because there's two kind of waves of this music. And Shout at the Devil and Quiet Riot's, it's their third record. Metal Health is technically their third record. Shows you that we're going to take the iconography of this thing called metal that's really popular overseas and take a little bit of this hardcore stuff with the leather and spiky stuff. These guys have crazy club performances. I'm sure we've all read about maybe Sully saw some of the early Wasp shows.
I'm not that old.
Where they
no.
So theatrics was something these guys were going for, because the bigger bands overseas had crazy theatrics. I think Randy Rhoads plays more in line with the album rock of the 70s, whereas Eddie Van Halen, especially when Eruption comes out, is almost like an alien. And Van Halen, while I do think they are in the DNA of this music, they will always, to me, kind of stand apart because they kind of do their own thing that those bands can't do. It's too hard to replicate but it's easier to replicate the album rock of the 70s because if I put a playlist up and I forgot to send it to Pascual and Sully, I call it Glam Jams, and I went through this about 126 songs from like 74 to about 91. And a lot of that stuff you can go, I don't know who this is unless you really liked that music and you know who the singer is. But when you put Van Halen on, you know it's Van Halen.
So here's my dumb question though, like to your point about, I guess Randy having more of a 70s vibe,
Definitely
more of a throwback, but Randy's solos were worked out, right? I mean, I think this is ultimately why I prefer listening to Randy solos to Eddie's, right? They're all pieces of music. They're clearly not improvised. Whereas Eddie's are three takes on three different improvised solos spliced together, whatever he did, right? He's improvising though. He's flying by the seat of his pants a lot more so than I know that Randy was. And in that sense, even though Eddie, there's no sort of jam band vibe to what Eddie Van Halen is doing. In that sense, his solos feel more like the wild spirit of the 70s.
Well, he's not a composer
with virtuosity. Right?
He's not the composer that he becomes post 1984.
Oh, sure, but
in the Hagar years,
I like Van Halen best. And again, it's weird that I have this trajectory with them. I didn't like Van Halen so much in the mid to late 80s. I didn't like the Van Hagar era as much as I liked the DLR era. Well, I fuck it, I can live with it. I really appreciate in retrospect. Well, one, I like the whimsy that David Lee Roth brought to it, in much the same way that Freddie Mercury kind of elevated Queen, right? Which without Freddie Mercury, as great as the band is, there's no Queen. But also I think that with Eddie, his playing in particular in the first 2 to 4 albums, I mean, it's amazing. Even if I couldn't appreciate it until well after the fact, from the tone compared to what other people are doing. But there's a whimsy in his playing too, right? There is a fire there that's really different at the very least from Randy's, because Randy's are worked out. And so there's a magic, if you will, that's a lot more like what you're going to get from 70s bands in that sense. Again, with virtuosity, which you're not going to get, than what you're going to get out of Randy. That's my...
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I kind of wonder because it kind of dawned on me like there's this again, because hair metal is sort of like a post facto definition anyway. So like what is it anyway? But when you talk about Van Halen sort of standing apart, like to me in my head, it's just like very obvious. I'm like, well, no, like Van Halen and like Motley Crue are in very different lanes, and the spirit is still there in both of them. But I realize like there is this kind of like musician that's on the Eddie side that always stood out a little bit in terms of just not feeling like the rest of that arena. And I right off the top of my head, I think of Nuno Betancourt, and like how Nuno is a very Eddie kind of guy. Like he's a really gymnastic kind of like dynamic, all over the place guy that's pushing some very weird sonic boundaries with like unconventional kind of progressions and stuff like that. And the reality is when I think of Extreme, like I think I love Nuno's work, but I saw Extreme last year touring with Living Color, who I was mainly there to see. But I loved watching Nuno play. I just, every time I've seen him play, I've always been just fascinated by him. But I'm also like, just the way he writes songs is like kind of secondary to how he plays them. And I feel kind of the same way about Van Halen, because in the Diamond Dave era, like it felt like Dave was really at the wheel and Eddie was just like putting the gas in the engine, and Nuno's kind of like that too, because I'm like, really in a vacuum, like I don't really think Extreme, they're not a band I would listen to very much, but like when I hear like that solo and Play With Me, I'm like Christ, like he takes a lot of that kind of like Yngwie classical vibe, but then he also just goes into this like kind of bombastic, like all over the place playing that you know Eddie was kind of known for. So to kind of wrap that all up, it just sort of feels like those guys never really fit the genre or quote unquote genre the way I would imagine it. And so for me, yeah, they are very much like Randy lives at the inception of that sound, and Eddie lives in the inception of a different thing that became bands like Extreme, and which are, you know, I guess you could call extreme hair metal. To me, they're a little, they lean towards that kind of like, you know,
They're
They're
post.
eclectic, right?
you know,
I mean,
Yeah.
Extreme is very eclectic.
They had
That
horns.
They are.
second album
Yeah.
with Porno Graffiti
they're
and
kind of
horns
proggy
and
too, you
Get the
know.
Funk Out. Nuno's blending funk influences, and that solo on Get the Funk Out. I mean, I'm with you, Pascual. I own the first two Extreme albums because of Nuno,
Yeah.
and only because of Nuno. But I appreciate the weirdness that they bring in the abstract. I guess I don't like Gary Sharon's voice that much. I think that's the big problem.
You're just a vocalist hater.
You know what? I do mainly listen to instrumental music. So
Sammy Hagar years of Van Halen where they
But I
actually
like
sound like a band
BOR.
suck.
But anyway,
Well,
but don't you hear some of